Representation matters. But as indigenous Chicano people, we can't just sit back and wait for mainstream media outlets to make it happen for us. And nor should we. We started the Tales from Atlantis podcast because we believe that it is imperative for Chicanos, Chicanas, and Chicanx people to produce our own media and tell our own stories. And the way we choose to do this is by using Buzzsprout to host the podcast. Buzzsprout is by far the easiest and best way to launch a professional podcast. You'll get a podcast website, audio players that you can drop into other websites, detailed analytics to see how people are listening, tools to promote your episodes, and much more. To start your own podcast and get a $20 Amazon gift card, follow the link in the show notes. This lets Buzzsprout know that we sent you and helps support the show. Buzzsprout, the easiest way to start a podcast. Now, on with the show.
You must excuse me. I've grown quite weary.
This hasn't been easy, I know. But you've learned a lesson. A lesson in honesty. Honesty to yourself and honesty to others. That lesson will stand you in good stead all your life.
I think we've all learned a good lesson. I've always heard that honesty is the best policy. Now I'm catching on to why that's so,
Greetings, dear listeners, and welcome to yet another episode of Tales from Atlantis, the podcast where we explore Mesoamerican pseudo-history, cultural identity, and other tales of adventure. We are your hosts, Curly Tlapoyawa.
And Ruben Arellano Tlacatecat.
So today we are joined by Dr. Mario Garza. Dr. Mario Garza is an elder of the Miakan-Garza Band of Coahuiltecans and the chair of the Board of Elders of the Indigenous Cultures Institute, located in San Marcos, Texas. He is the Cultural Preservation Officer of the Miakan-Garza Band. He earned a multi-disciplinary Ph.D. from Michigan State University in social science with areas of concentration in sociology, political science, and social work. He has been active in graves protection and repatriation since 1991, participating in reburial ceremonies at the Comanche Cemetery in Fort Hood, Texas, including 2 Coahuiltecan reburials. Dr. Garza served 2 tours of duty in Vietnam with the 1616th Medical Clearing Company, 44th Medical Brigade, U.S. Army. He currently lives in San Marcos, Texas, near the sacred springs that archeologists believe to be the oldest continuously inhabited site in North America. So, dear listeners, we welcome Dr. Mario Garza. Thank you for joining us, sir.
Well, thank you, Curly and Ruben, for inviting me. I'm glad to be here.
Well, we're glad to have you here. This is an amazing opportunity.
Thank you.
When we were putting this trip together, I told Ruben we got to be sure to record an episode while we're out there. So this is actually, listeners, this is part of the Tales from Atlantis road trip.
And this is our very first in-person
interview
episode, both me and Curly and with a live guest at the same time. So that's a treat for it, and I'm honored that episode happens to be with you, Dr. Garza.
The live guest, you're referring to me?
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, we're assuming you're alive, but
well, you're certainly a guest.
Okay. For sure.
So we usually like to start with asking our guests to tell us a little bit about themselves besides the introduction. Is there anything else that you'd like for the world to know about you, who you are, your background?
Well, I was born in Falfurrias, Texas, and they tell me that I was born at home because at that time they didn't allow non-white people in their hospital. So I was born at home, and then we moved to Laredo when I was 3 years old because the doctor recommended my mother move to a drier country, and not country, but drier place. And so I grew up in Laredo, Texas. Then I started moving around. After being in the Army, I came back and went to Houston and finished my degree, got my bachelor's, and then I got recruited to go to Michigan State. I got my master's and decided to get a Ph.D. And then I came back to Texas, where I have been living ever since. I always felt that something in Texas was pulling me. One time I went with my father to visit some friends of his in Bruni, Texas, where he was born. And I met an old guy who told me that once in a while he goes back to Bruni to visit because when he was born, they buried the after birth and his umbilical there. And so his umbilical was always pulling him back to Bruni. So then I said, well, maybe that's what keeps pulling me back to Texas, that my umbilical is buried back here in Texas.
Nice. So
That's beautiful. So as an archaeologist, I interact a lot with NAGPRA and repatriation efforts, and I know that you are very active in helping to get burials repatriated. What was the origin of that? Like, when did the Indigenous Cultures Institute, or just you as an individual, if it happened before the Indigenous Cultures Institute was established, what drew you to that work?
Well, I was involved with an intertribal group here in Texas, and then I also became involved with Fort Hood. We used to go there and do ceremonies, and then they found that there was an old medicine wheel there, and we reactivated it. And the archaeologists at Fort Hood started getting remains from different tribes. So we established a repatriation cemetery inside Fort Hood, and we invited all the VIA tribes in the area. The only tribe that showed up were the Comanches, so we named the cemetery the Comanche Cemetery. So that's when I started getting involved with repatriation, and I learned that most indigenous groups believe that when a person dies, it's only the physical body that dies, and when then the person is buried, there's two processes that happen. One is that the physical body starts rejoining back with Mother Earth and becoming, part of the earth, part of the trees, part of the water, and all the stuff that was there. But also that the spirit starts a spiritual journey. And when you disturb and dig up the remains, that you interrupt both processes, the physical journey and the spiritual journey. So then that's when I really found the rationale or the reason why we needed to do repatriation and start repatriating remains. And this is a big problem nationwide. There's, according to inventories, there are over 7 million remains of our ancestors that have been dug up.
7 million.
7 million. 7 million. I mean, that's a pretty big number.
Yeah, that's substantial.
You're right. And that's, and I know that it's impossible for us to repatriate 7 million remains, or even the over 5,000 remains from Texas Indians. But, we're trying to develop a process and a procedure and start that, process going. I mean, I've been involved with this You mentioned in my inventory to 1991, but it was NAPRA was passed in 1990, and that was like about a couple of years before NAPRA when I became involved. So we're trying to get that thing, more developed and getting more remains repatriated. Here in Texas, we're the only tribe that has their own repatriation cemetery. So, the city of San Marcos gave us 5 acres in one of their green parks so we could establish our repatriation site. And we already have 7 remains buried there. We're going to be reinterning 2 more pretty soon. And so that's only here in Texas. I personally was involved in the biggest repatriation here in Texas when we repatriated over 189 remains back at Mission San Juan back in 1999. And so that was a pretty dramatic experience for us when we had to prepare and rebury that many remains, including remains of infants. And so we had to wrap them, prepare them, and a lot of the spirits of the remains were very angry, and we could feel the energy. It took us 3 weeks to prepare to wrap all the 189 remains. Wow. And getting back them ready to rebury them. And this were remains that the Catholic Church allowed and actually invited archeologists to come and remove them. And they send them all over the nation, I guess, for other archaeological students to study or whatever. But it took us 30 years to get them back. And when we got them back, a lot of we just got them in pieces, little pieces of bone, and they had numbers on them. And so that was
physically, like numbers were physically written on the bones
numbers
themselves.
Were written with some type of ink or pen or whatever on the remains, on the bones. And I see this as a problem that a lot of people do not consider Indians or Native Americans or whatever you want to call us, that we're actually human. They see us as less than human.
Well, that kind of leads us to a question that I wanted to ask you. So your title with the ICI, one of your main titles is Cultural Preservation Officer, and we were talking about that earlier before we started recording. Could you tell us a little bit about what that entails and how it ties into the repatriation and why it's important? I think one of the things that is missing in the public is understanding why it's important for Native American peoples to repatriate remains, those that want to do so, because obviously there's certain Native peoples that don't bother with it, don't care to mess around with it because that's something that they're not prepared to do. But those that do, like yourself, why is it important for repatriation to be allowed to take place and for institutions to return those remains?
Okay, well, first let me address the title of Cultural Preservation Officer, because a lot of people do not understand. They really do not understand repatriation, so they don't understand what Cultural Preservation Officer means. They think that it's a person that's supposed to help preserve the culture of the tribe, but actually it doesn't have that much to do with preserving the culture. A Culture Preservation Officer is the person in that tribe that is in charge of trying to get remains of their ancestors to repatriate them. And we think that that's important, so the spirit that we believe is out there in limbo after the body was removed from the original grave, so that spirit would be back in peace and continue its spiritual journey wherever that happened to have been going. And also, we feel that it's important for the physical body to disintegrate back into Mother Earth, into the earth, and to continue those two processes. And because in a lot of this, because we have visited a few institutions, and these institutions can be either city, county, state, federal, museums, and some other state institutions that have physical possession of the remains. And they are usually in cardboard boxes, in some metal shapes, in some room, in some places. We went to the University of Texas in Austin, to the building where they had over 2,400 of the remains of our ancestors, because one of the professors from UT had a class there and invited me and my wife Maria Rocha to do a presentation on repatriation. And after we finished our presentation for that class, we asked the woman in charge of the remains of the collection, and they're called collections, and I know there's some people at UT that object to being called collectors, but they collect remains and they call them collections, so we call them collectors. And we asked them if they would allow us to go to the room where the remains were kept and sing some songs, say some prayers with the remains, and they said no.
What?
And we were not going to be hurting anybody, but they would not allow us to pray with the remains of our ancestors.
Did they say why you couldn't at least go in there and pray?
They didn't say anything. I mean, they just said that we would contaminate the remains, but we could look through the window and we could see that they had some students that are working with the remains, and we figured if those students can go there and not contaminate the remains, I mean, why can we not go there and not contaminate the remains? They just were acting like not good people.
Colonizers.
Yeah, say it.
I was going to use another term, and it starts with an A, and then it's got a couple of S's, but anyway, that's let's not go there.
Well, do you think they were worried that if they allowed, I mean, coming from their perspective as Western, white colonial power structure, if we allow these native people to come in and do this, then that's going to set a dangerous precedent, because then we're going to have to allow all the native people to come in and do this. And then we're going to, like you said, we're not even seen as human beings most of the time. So then, what's this position that we're giving these people? These are our objects, which is a lot of times that's how they look at these remains. Like, these are just objects. They're not human beings.
Archaeological objects.
Yeah, just objects for us to study and poke and prod, not somebody's ancestors, not part of the cultural fabric or the cultural continuity of this area. I'm wondering if that had something to do with it.
Well, the thing is, they always say, if we allow you, then we're going to have to allow, descendants of those 7 million people that we have. Well, the thing is, why do you have 7 million in the first place?
Yeah.
If they didn't have that, then they would not be creating that problem themselves.
And isn't it true that most of the remains that they have aren't even being studied? They're just boxed and stored somewhere?
So this is a problem with archaeology that we talk about all the time. It's like everything that we, if we're doing field collecting, if we're going out, and because usually we just record objects in the field and we leave them in the field. And there's a big movement to be like, we should stop collecting stuff. We have enough stuff in archives right now that hasn't even been touched. We haven't done research. So all of this talk about, well, we need this for the research value. Well, there's all this other stuff that hasn't even been looked at. What are you talking about? Research value. Research this other stuff and leave all this, leave these things alone.
It kind of reminds me of that recent incident with the archaeologist that we were talking about.
Yeah, she who should not be named,
who took a selfie picture and posted it on some social media site where she's holding the skull. I guess after being gone from her space for a couple of years because of the pandemic and the shutdown. When she finally gets a chance to go back to the collection, right? The collection. She takes out a skull, holds it, and what is it that she says in her caption? It
says something like, and she's holding it up like it's a trophy,
right? And
the caption said, like, "I'm so glad to be back with my old friends," and she's just posing with it, and it's a really dehumanizing image, and she's just completely tone deaf. She doesn't understand why anybody would have been offended by this. Well, this is my collection. That's how she sees it.
Right.
Like, this was my collection.
And it goes back to what you were saying.
And I think that's a problem with the mentality of some of the archaeologists, because they remove them, then they feel that they own those remains.
Yes.
And then when you try to get them back and repatriate them, because we had that problem with some of the older archaeologists here at Texas State University here in San Marcos, they said, "No, you're not going to get those remains. Those are my remains." And so
Wow.
we had a lot of hassles and even a lot of opposition in getting our repatriation cemetery started, because of that mentality that we were not going to get any remains to be buried there. But it goes back to what I mentioned earlier, and you guys have repeated, that a lot of these people do not see us as human beings. And I think that started even before Columbus came to this world, this new world, when Pope Alfonso V did in a papal bull and said that when the Europeans came down here, because the countries were ruled by non-Christians, that the non-Christians were less than human. And those European adventurers had could rape these people, could steal their lands, could kill them, could do all these things because we were less than people. And this was like 50 years before 1492, so this was in 1452. But the problem is that mentality is still there today. And that mentality has been affecting all the dealings that the government has had with Native people. With all the treaties that they never kept, and even if you look at the Declaration of Independence, they called us, savages and less than human and all that. So the mentality has not changed since then. And when the Pope said that, and at that time the Pope was the voice of God at that time. Mm-hmm. So whatever God said, that was the whatever Pope said, that was the word of God. And if he said that indigenous people were less than human, then we're less than human, and that still has persisted till today. And even now, once in a while, a group of Native elders go to Rome and try to visit the sitting Pope and try to get him to change that. But a Pope cannot change what some previous Pope had said. And so that has not been changed, and it will never be changed.
Interesting. I was wondering, you brought up the word colonial mentality, or that phrase, or one of you did. And I'm thinking, can you speak to the process that it's taking you as the Miakan-Garza Band of Coahuiltecans to get to the point where you were at least able to get the state to recognize you as Native people, and the difference between being recognized as a state tribe versus being recognized as a federal tribe, and how that's affected your repatriation efforts?
Okay. Well, and that's a problem, that you need to be recognized as Indians. And the problem is that, you're not really considered a real Indian, a true Indian, unless the white government recognizes you as a tribal entity. And that's had been a big objection for us in our repatriation efforts, that we try to get remains. Like UT Austin was the first thing they said. When we asked for the remains, they said, "Oh, we would love to give you the remains, but you're not federally recognized, so we cannot give you the remains." And we said, well, NAPRA has amended the law, and we have already gotten remains through NAPRA. And so nothing happened, and then, another excuse. One of the times that we were at UT Austin, and we were talking about the remains, and then they said, well, we cannot give you the remains because we don't have any money. What? University of Texas Austin, the richest university in Texas, if not in the world, doesn't have any money? I said, how much is it going to cost you to walk from where you're sitting across the hall to that room and get us the remains? I mean, how much is that going to cost you? I can go there and get the remains for you, if that would take some money.
I'll do it for free.
I'll do it for free. But so it's always be one excuse after another. But the main one is you're not federally recognized, so you're not real Indians. Mm-hmm. And and we were able to the problem is that the state of Texas does not have the process to recognize native tribes or native people. So we got some representatives and senators to pass some bills recognizing us as Texas Indians, which they did. But when a collector doesn't want to give you the remains, which they don't, they'll use any excuse, and that's a very convenient, excuse. You're not federally recognized, so you're not a real Indian.
Could you elaborate on, for example, and it's related to this notion of what makes a real Indian versus someone who is a pretend Indian, right? You hear a lot of people use that word, pretend Indian, or wannabe. So how did you arrive at your indigeneity, and through this process that's taken you most of your life, right, to get to this point where you are today, and through the years that you've put into the efforts of repatriation, and how indigeneity has affected you and how it continues to affect the way that you view the world?
Well, I think that I'm fortunate in a way that growing up, we used to visit a lot of my father's relatives in Mexico. And they would, for example, he was a very charismatic guy, very outgoing, and he was always asked to, when some young people from his old village wanted to get married, they would ask my father to go and ask for the bride's hand in marriage, because they felt that they were not going to say no to my father. But we don't know if the family was anxious to get rid of the woman. But anyway.
You remember what part of Mexico is this?
Well, he was from Mier.
Mier is in that's along the border, right?
No, it's not along the border. Well, it's close to the border, but it's not in the interior. But anyway. And so we would go, and like all of the ceremonies were 4 days long. Mm-hmm. I mean, the weddings were 4 days long. The baptismals, everything, and I remember that, I mean, they would make a barbacoa de pozo and put a goat in there. That, Friday night, Saturday morning, we would go there, get the goat out, and the meat was made barbacoa.
So delicious, right?
So delicious.
Cooked underground.
And then later on, as I started growing up, and this is another thing that my father always said. My father would always say, "Donde quiera es Campo Santo." Mm-hmm. And at that time, I didn't know what he meant, and I thought that Campo Santo. When he said Campo Santo, he was saying it a cemetery, but it translates into sacred land.
Mm-hmm.
So what he was saying was, all the land is sacred. And then later on, as I grew up, I said, okay, well, this is what my father said. And then I said, okay, the ceremonies that we went to were indigenous ceremonies and all that stuff. And my uncles would talk that their father, my grandfather, was a cacique of the tribe. And then he was murdered by somebody and all that stuff. So then I said, well, I mean, and then this is another thing that when the United States outlawed all our ceremonies, we could not do, and when I was growing up, I even had some friends my own age that went to prison for doing sweat lodge ceremonies, for participating in sweat lodge ceremonies. And so, see, the Native American Religious Freedom Act was not passed till 1978. I mean, I was already 35. I had already, been to the Army, been to Vietnam and back, and I was already 35. And I remember growing up that a lot of the people that were doing peyote ceremonies were underground, and they had to do it in hiding and all that stuff. And I remember my parents talking, well, so-and-so got arrested for having peyote and all that stuff and doing ceremonies. So when I was growing up, I mean, it was illegal to be indigenous.
Yeah.
And so it was different. And people ask me now, young people said, what was it like growing up being Indian? And I said, well, I mean, we were illegal. I mean, it was, we had to.
We weren't allowed to exist.
We were not allowed to exist. We were not supposed to say we were indigenous and all that stuff. I remember the first time I went to Austin, because I grew up in Laredo. The first time I went to Austin, I saw some signs that said, no dogs, Indians, or Mexicans allowed.
Wow.
And this was in the early 60s. So I grew up with all of that, with that different attitudes and different culture and I forgot your question.
No, that's perfect.
Yeah, that's perfect. So we're here in Texas, and before I ask the question, I do want to say that luckily things in archaeology are slowly starting to change now as we get more and younger native people becoming archaeologists and bringing a different perspective and demanding that respect be given. So I'm getting to watch it in real time, which is pretty exciting to see this shift in mentality. I don't know how long it's going to take because, we do live in the United States, but hopefully things will, hopefully it won't take long, right? Hopefully all these young archaeologists, indigenous archaeologists are going to make a difference in the way that our people are treated. But we're here in Texas, and Texas, more than any other state in the United States, has a very unique relationship with the medicine, with peyote. For people who don't know what that relationship is, I was wondering if you could expand on that a little bit.
Okay. Yeah. One, the thing is that peyote only grows in what is called the gardens. It only grows in a part in South Texas and northern Mexico. In all the world, that's the only place that peyote grows. So peyote is regulated legally by the Department of Public Safety. I do remember the name. The Department of Public Safety, the Drug Enforcement Division is under that program. And like we have I wrote this book some time ago, and I wrote the story of how Quanah Parker at one time decided to visit his white relatives. He wanted to visit his uncle John, that had married a Coahuiltecan woman and was living in Mexico. So he went to visit his uncle John and his aunt, and he was gored by a longhorn bull. And so his aunt got him a Coahuiltecan curandero to take care of him. And this was the curandero that introduced Quanah Parker to the peyote.
And Quanah Parker is Comanche, right?
He's Comanche, right. And Quanah Parker is the one that's supposed to have registered, incorporated the Native American Church. And he even called it the Native American Church. And if you go online and look at the Bill of Rights for the church, it says that it's incorporated as a Christian church. And so he incorporated a lot of white Christian values, and that was, I'm assuming, because he didn't want them getting killed.
It was a pragmatic decision.
It was a very pragmatic decision that they were supposed to be at a church, and they were kneeling, and they were Christians and all this stuff. It wasn't like when they saw the Indians dancing and say, oh, they're doing some ceremony, and they would go and kill all the Indians. So he went back with his songs that he was given, and supposedly, some big bush, bags of peyote, of the medicine, as we call it. And so he introduced it to the people back there, and they started, using the medicine and doing the peyote. And I personally believe that the Native American Church, developed from the Coahuiltecan all-night peyote ceremony. And and I do a presentation on this, and I also have it in my book, 5 white facts that I use to support that. One is that the medicine only grows in the Coahuiltecan traditional land. And so, because it grows in our land, we were one of the first who started using it. Number 2, the 4 required songs that are used, that every roadman or the person who runs the ceremony uses at every ceremony. The three songs are in Coahuiltecan. One song is in Comecrudo, which is dialect of the Coahuiltecan language family. And another thing is that all the songs, most of the old songs, end with the phrase "Hene yo we," and which is Coahuiltecan with "all that I am" or "all that there is." So we finish our prayer with "all that I am." And a lot of the songs are traditional water songs, and they talk about Yanawana, a very common song that I hear at every ceremony I go to is Yanawana Yo, which means all the water is holy. Yo means all. Yanawana is the spirit of the water. So if you study the Coahuiltecan language, and there's a free dictionary out there online that you can download free, and looks at some of the words, you can see that most of the words that are used are Coahuiltecan. And also the Catholic Church tried to do away, for over 260 years, they tried to do away with the use of peyote. And they used 2 manuals to convert the indigenous people, and the manuals are in Coahuiltecan. So of all the languages that were available at the time, the 2 manuals that the church used for over 265 years are in Coahuiltecan. one is it's a manual to administer the 7 sacraments. Mm-hmm. And the other one is a confessionario on how to confess the people. And it has some words like, have you drank the blood of man? Like we're vampires? Okay. And so...
Can you see your own reflection?
You see your own reflection the next day. And so the church itself used the Coahuiltecan language for over 265 years to convert the Indians and to do away with the peyote. But after 265 years, they kind of gave up on that, but they co-opted and started using a lot of that. They even came up with El Santo Niño de Peyotes. Mm-hmm. I mean, they created a saying just for the people, and they call it the Santo Niño de Peyotes. And so they started, and then the healing power of the peyote was because of this connection to the Catholic Church and all that stuff. So it was they co-opted all that spiritual belief. I don't want to call it a religion, but that spiritual belief into Catholicism. Just like they co-opted a lot of our ceremonies, like the coming of age woman ceremony into the quinceañera, and then they do it in the church, and they have all that stuff. So,
well, you'd mentioned ceremonies, and one of the things that Ruben and I discuss a lot on this podcast is this perception that for a ceremony to be accepted as valid, it has to have this sense of antiquity. Like, oh, we learned this ceremony. The ceremony came from 100 years ago or 200 years ago, and it was taught to me by this elder, and it's passed along. But what we're seeing now, because of repatriation, is the need to basically create new ceremonies, because there was never a need before. Once you buried somebody or you interred their remains, whether you burned the bodies or you buried them whole, that was it. They were going to be consumed by the earth. You didn't have to, you didn't need a ceremony for, well, what's going to happen if they get dug up and we have to rebury them. So what's the process of that you go through? Like, okay, we need to create new ceremonies.
Well, yeah, and that's something that all the tribes that are now involved in repatriation had to do. Every tribe had to invent a new ceremony to deal with repatriating remains of their ancestors, and we have all come up with different ceremonies for that, because we're peyote people. Part of our new ceremony is that we do an all-night peyote ceremony with the remains, and then we bury them the following day. And but we all had to invent new ceremonies, and we all invented them different. I've been to some other tribal repatriation ceremonies, and they do it different, which is correct for them. Mm-hmm. What is correct for us is correct for us, but it's not correct for everybody.
So when you approach a university, because Texas is pretty unique in that I think something ridiculous like 80% of Texas is private land. It's this really high number. I don't know if that's the exact number. So privately held, if you find human remains on private land, they don't necessarily have to turn over remains.
Well,
right?
that's a part. I'm glad you brought it up because I had forgotten that. But part of NEPRA, the Native American Grace Protection and Repatriation Act, only applies to remains found on public land. Mm-hmm. And like you mentioned in Texas, the number I have heard is 82% of the land in Texas is private. And so remains removed from private land do not do not apply through NAPRA. And even the remains that we're going to be reburying this month, they were removed from private land. So the individuals that were removing the remains were arrested and tried, and they were given 2 years of prison terms. And so the private landowners gave us the remains.
So these individuals were trespassing on.
They were
on private
trespassing.
land.
They were
Okay.
trespassing on public land. I don't know if they were jumping fences or coming in through the river or whatever, but they were trespassing on private land with the purpose of stealing human remains and artifacts, because our people used to bury a lot of what are called artifacts with remains.
Mm-hmm.
Jewelry, necklaces, tools, knives, hatchets, whatever that the relatives of the person thought that he might need in the spirit world, and would bury them with that. And so there's a big market for Native American remains on the black market, and even some of them steal those remains and sell them overseas.
That's so gross.
And there are people that want to have a skull on their mantle or on their desk or whatever. That is very, very gross, and
That's like the height of disrespect, of dehumanization.
I would agree with that. Yeah.
What kind of laws are in place to sort of help prevent some of this from happening? Like if there are looters who are going to sites and specifically taking human remains, I mean, you would think that there would be some kind of international agreement, especially because I'm assuming a lot of these buyers are international buyers and Europeans who want to have a piece of Native America, especially if it's a remain of a human ancestor. Are there some laws in place that you can think of that are supposed to be preventing this sort of stuff from happening?
Not that I'm aware of. The NAPRA was, I think, a first step here in the United States to prevent that. So now the selling of human remains is illegal because of NAPRA, but that only applies to here in the United States. But there should be some laws to criminalize remains being sold overseas from here.
There's laws in place like the Antiquities Act, but those only apply to public lands or government lands, and not private. So that's like what makes Texas so unique is almost all the land here is privately held. So you don't have a lot of recourse.
So even if there was such a law at the international level, because the laws in Texas are such and the way that NAGPRA works, even if someone was to find some human remains on private land, whether they were looted or they were found legitimately, quote unquote, and they're sold at market, there's nothing that anyone can do about that.
Well, okay. First, according to Texas law, private property is king. When you own land, you own everything about your land, above, everything on top of the land, and everything under the land. Like there's oil, you own the oil. If there's gold on top of the land, you own the gold. But now with NAPRA, they're trying to make it illegal to sell human remains.
Okay.
So but NAPRA was only passed in 1990, November. So last November was 31 years ago.
Yeah.
And in 31 years ago, a lot of collectors, the universities and museums have not returned one single remain, even though the law says you need to do an inventory and notify the tribes that were in your area so you can start returning the remains. But there's a lot of problems with with NAPRA, and they have been trying to fix some of those problems. One of the problems is that when you request human remains, the collector is going to say, okay, you need to show some cultural affiliation to these remains.
Right.
And you can do sending whatever documentation you can, and I even joke that you can get a letter from Geronimo's mother attesting to the ownership of the remains. But if the collector doesn't want to give you the remains, they're going to say this is not proof enough.
Right.
And to give you an example, when we got remains from Texas State University, we used certain conditions. When we applied for remains from University of Texas Austin, we used the same argument.
Yeah.
Texas State accepted it. UT said no. This is not cultural affiliation. And another thing that I want to mention before I forget about UT, they rent those remains that they have stolen and that they have there.
Say that again.
Rent.
They rent them
for money.
So they make money off
They
of...
make money out of the remains of our ancestors. They rent them for thousands of dollars. So if you got money, you can rent remains and get remains.
Who rents them and for what purpose?
I don't know.
What do people do with rented remains?
Yeah, that's a good question, because maybe human osteology classes, but when I took osteology, they brought in human remains, but the remains that the University of New Mexico had for this class were people who had
donated their
bodies to science.
For
right?
science, exactly.
So that's a totally different thing.
It's like for medical school.
Yeah. But what you're talking about is this university is renting out these remains for research or for some purpose.
Yeah, and not only that, but they have two forms. And they I don't know if they still have them, but they used to have them online. And one of the forms was a regular form that you wanted to rent certain remains. And another form was that whatever you were going to use the remains for was going to damage the remains. You would fill out a different form that the remains were going to be destroyed.
So it was just paperwork.
It was just paperwork, and you pay for them, and you mark them, you break them, whatever. I mean, whatever you're going to do with the remains.
So when they rent the remains, they can do whatever they want with the remains, is what I'm hearing?
If you fill out the correct form.
And that would be like paying extra, like some kind of insurance?
Yeah.
Like you're renting a car and you get the insurance on it.
Right.
You get the insurance on it. If you wreck the car, hey, there it is.
Yeah. So that's like the height of dehumanization.
And the height of arrogance.
For real.
Extreme arrogance.
So one of the things that happens here in Texas, and it might sound like I'm harping on Texas.
Yes, you
but
are.
Texas has a lot of issues. One thing that really I found surprising when I first started studying archaeology is that here in Texas, you have people who own land who basically, we call them pay to dig operations. You could show up to somebody's ranch and you give them $50 or whatever.
They let you dig.
And they give you a shovel and a screen, and you get to go out.
I'm from Texas and I don't know this.
No, but yeah, and that's another point about Texas. There's certain places that had caves, and these caves are known to have a lot of archaeological material, remains, artifacts, whatever, or all of the above. And the landowner was making money rented, like you said, pay to dig. Anybody who wanted to go and play archaeologist or grave digger or whatever would pay whatever rate happened to be at that time. And I don't know if you had to bring your own digging tools or they would rent you some or whatever, but you could go in there and dig up human. And if you found a human remain, you could take the human remain with you.
You got to keep it.
You got to keep it.
Yeah, there's one, and I forget the name of this ranch. I wish I had kept better track of the name of this one ranch that I found out about. But they actually have a human skull from an indigenous person that was found on their land, but they have it on display in their house, and they encourage you to rub it for good luck before
Like the Buddha?
Yeah, before you go out and dig on their land, and then you could take pictures with it and pose with it. So when that woman, that archaeologist, posed with her picture, it just made me think immediately of that. Like, how disrespectful. Like, I remembered how disgusted I felt when I found out about this private, pay to dig operation. But then to see an archaeologist who's supposed to be a professional,
the director of all people,
being so dismissive and dehumanizing.
Well, it goes back to what I've been saying, that they do not consider us human. I mean, it's like finding a skull of a cat or a dog or a gorilla or whatever. Even though, I mean, to me, all those animals are sentient beings, and it needs to be respected. But
it's a huge shift in perception, is what you just described. An indigenous worldview, versus a Western colonialist white worldview. It's very different, right? Just the way you look at life, the way you look at animals, the way you look at the relatives we have on this planet as being sentient beings that are worthy of our respect, that are sacred, that should be honored, versus these are just objects for my enjoyment that I could rent and just throw away if I want.
And talking about that, I mean, we do have a different perception. Like, we believe that the river is a sentient being, that the Mother Earth is a sentient being. And talking about Mother Earth being a sentient being, throughout history, you have noticed that sometimes Mother Earth gets mad at the humans on it and sends some things to the birds, and sends some punishment against humans. But
I don't know if the audience can hear this, but the birds are cheering on Dr. Garza in the window.
Yeah, you noticed that it started happening when we said that
when we started talking about respecting sentient beings.
The birds are sentient beings.
They started cheering you on. Tell them.
They're tapping at the window.
Well, I'm wondering, in general, how long does a process like this take from the time you approach a university to where you're actually, able to repatriate and rebury ancestral remains? Like, what's
okay? Well, it depends on a lot of factors. One of them, it depends on the university or the agency that has the remains. There are some of them that are willing to return the remains. So, like, we had a quick turnaround when we requested remains from Texas State University. It took us, I think, 5 years, which I thought was a long time, but it seems to be average. We attended a national repatriation conference, and I found out that a lot of the other applicants were having the same problem we are. I mean, some of them were taking 7 or longer years to get remains that they repatriated. And I'm talking about BIA tribes. And so it depends on the institution that has the remains. And the thing is, if the institution does not want to return the remains, I mean, it can take you 20, 30 or more years to get those remains back.
Wow.
Right. You were saying that the remains that you repatriated in 1999 at San Juan Capistrano, right?
Yeah.
Those took about 30 years. But that situation was different, right? Because that was through the Catholic Church.
That was through the Catholic Church. And that was and they were under church property, which, I mean, they were considered to be, remains from, on private land. Mm-hmm. So the church was the one who controlled those, not getting us not getting back those remains for 30 years.
Do you remember what the holdup was? Why it took them so long to return the remains?
The church did not want to give them back.
But what was their argument? Why didn't they want, like,
Did they have a rationale that
Yeah.
they even offered?
I don't remember the rationale they used, but some of them don't feel like they need to give you a rationale.
Mhm.
Yeah, for sure.
And look, and another thing is, like, for example, we have been trying for 6 years now to get those 3 remains out of 2,400 plus remains that UT Austin has from San Marcos. We have been trying for 6 years to get them. And I think that we have not progressed from day one. And even about a year and a half, we got the students organized, and they protested, and they met with the president, and he was a newly elected president. And the day that the students met with him, he sent us an email. He said, I'm going to start moving on getting you the remains to repatriate them. And then the next thing we heard, we asked NEPRA, and they said, well, we got a request from UT Austin that they want to repatriate the remains, and that no Native American tribe has requested those remains. And they knew, NEPRA knew that that was not true, because they knew that we had been requesting those remains for over 5 years at that time. So even with a promise in writing from the president of the university, we have not gotten those remains. And we're going on past 6 years now.
Wow.
And the attorney, even when the attorneys make that request, the response from NEPRA back was saying, you quoted the wrong part of the law. If you want the remains, you need to quote this particular part of the law.
So they're looking for some kind of technicality to disqualify or even consider repatriating the remains. They'll search for any single thing.
It's like a bureaucratic game.
Yeah.
Yeah, right.
Seems like.
And the thing I've noticed about lawyers, they feel that when they state something, it becomes truth, that it becomes the law, and that you're too dumb, and so they tell you this, that you're going to have to accept them because they're attorneys and they're the vice president of legal affairs of a major university. But they play those games, and you say this, I say this,
It's all about the interpretation. I mean, that's what makes the legal system what it is, right? From the very beginning, it was constructed, it was designed to work that way so that people could argue both sides.
Con dinero baila el perro.
Con dinero baila el perro.
Well, I don't want to take up too much of your time, but I did want to ask, best case scenario, like if you had the power to just say, this is how things are going to be run, what would your best case scenario be? What would the system be like in your opinion, if it was a just and equitable system?
Well, I think that if any tribal group, any tribal community in Texas, and I'm not talking about BIA because we don't have any Texas BIA Indians, if that group would request some remains, that this is one of the facts about our work, is that we have only been requesting remains that they're over 1,000 years old. And 1,000 years ago, there was no United States. There was no federally recognized tribes. And so we request remains that are over 1,000 years old And we're saying the Coahuiltecans, which we consider to be our ancestors, were the only Indians in this area, in Central Texas, in South Texas. So we're requesting these remains, and they say, well, they're not your ancestors because there were no group called Coahuiltecans at that time. There was no group called the Miakan. And we're saying, well, we were the only Indians here then, so we have to be their descendants, and we only want them so we can repatriate them. We're not going to sell them to make money. We're not going to put them on exhibit. We're not going to do that. So a perfect system would be for all the collectors to start returning, like the law says, to the tribes. And we have had some remains returned to different groups from private owners. DuPont, they were doing some construction and land owned by the DuPont Corporation, and they found some remains. So they called a meeting, and they two tribes went, and one of the tribes started not acting properly. So they said, "Go, you need to leave the room." And the other group that remained got the remains, and they repatriate him. And to me, the main thing was that the remains were repatriated, and not on. They're Texas Indians. I'm glad some Texas Indian got him and repatriate him. So I think that we need to start repatriate him, those remains. The new director of Terrell, the group in UT Austin, his goal or plan is to talk to the Texas Department of Public Parks and get enough land donated. I don't know, we're going to need like 50 acres or something. I don't know how much, but he wants to repatriate all the remains together there. And if that happens, that would be fine, because to me, the main thing is for the remains to be repatriated. Mm-hmm. And if UT does not have any experience in repatriating remains, but I'm sure that they would ask some native people to go and pray and do ceremonies and all that stuff. And if that happens, that would be good, but I don't see that happening knowing the actors involved. Mm-hmm. I'm not talking about the higher-ups.
And just to be clear, you mentioned earlier that there's no Texas BIA tribes in Texas. Can you explain that for the listener who might be wondering? I thought there were some federally recognized tribes in Texas. Can you distinguish between what
okay, yeah, it's a good question, because some people are not clear on that. We have 3 Indian reservations in Texas. However, none of those 3 Indian tribes are originally from Texas. The Tiwa were from New Mexico, the Alabama Gachara from Alabama, and the Kickapoo were from Illinois, and even there's another tribe, another branch in Nacimiento in Mexico.
And then there's also, I think, in Oklahoma, right? There's some in Oklahoma.
Yeah, I think there's some there too. So out of the 3 tribes, none of those are Texas Indians. The original Texas Indians, none of us have federal recognition, and that's because of the unique history that we had, first the Spaniards came and colonized this area that used to be Mexico, and then Mexico won its independence from Spain, and then Mexico allowed some Western people to settle there, and they wanted to keep their slaves, and Mexico said, no, we don't allow slaves. So then they said, well, we don't want to be under Mexico anymore. So they declared their independence, and they wanted independence, and became a state. And the first governor of the Republic of Texas,
was it Lamar?
One more before Lamar, Sam Houston.
Houston.
Sam Houston was friendly with the Indians. He was even married to 3 different Cherokee women, not at the same time. He was not that brave. But anyways, but the second president of the Republic, Mirabeau Lamar, passed a policy to kill all the Indians or exterminate all the Indians or move them out. And so he started this policy that to kill the Indians or move them out. And a lot of our ancestors, for the sake of survival, decided to say that they were not Indian, that they were Mexican. Because the Texas government, the Texas Rangers, Texas militia could not tell the difference between a Mexican and a Mexican Indian.
Which is the same thing.
Which actually biologically, it's the same thing. And at that time, ethnically, it was the same thing. So after a while, so by the time that Texas became part of the United States, all the Indians, have been killed or moved or whatever. So none of the Indian groups had any land that the government could sign a treaty with them and move them to a reservation to take over their land, like they did with all the other Indians.
Mm-hmm.
So we ended up with no land, no, and no federal recognition and all that. And I wanted to mention something that I just thought about that important. There's a lot of people that say, hey, what happened to you guys happened a long time ago. Why don't you accept it and move on? But the problem is that we cannot move on because everything they did in the past is affecting us today.
Yeah.
I mean, when we lost our land, we lost our sacred sites.
Yeah. And
we had a covenant to keep doing ceremonies in our sacred sites. This morning we were in one of our famous sacred sites, or close by anyway, where we believe that's where we originated. But we can, but we cannot go pray. We have 4 sacred water sites. I mean, one in Austin. We cannot go there because it's part of a park and it's too crowded and too popular.
Yeah.
I mean, we had a ceremony there. We had more than 50 people come in during the ceremony. What are you guys doing? Can I come in? And another one is in
San Antonio.
In Barton Springs. Well, first.
Well, Barton Springs is in Austin.
Well, yeah, Barton Springs is in Austin. The other one is Comanche Springs in New Braunfels.
Right.
And they said, yeah, you can do a ceremony, but you have to be out of here by 6 o'clock, and you cannot have any fires, and you cannot make any noise. So we cannot have a ceremony. The other one is in San Marcos, which we used to pay to go do ceremony. Now we can do it free. The other one is San Antonio, but San Antonio, San Pedro Springs has the same problem as Austin.
Yeah.
I mean, it's too public, too private, and you're never going to be able to do a ceremony with 1,000 people there around you.
Just looking at you.
Just looking at you and all that stuff. And so, but that's only one of the problems. The other problem is, we still, because we're not federally recognized, I mean, we cannot use eagle feathers legally. We cannot, do a lot of our ceremonies. Anyway.
Well, I want to thank you, Dr. Garza, for taking the time to talk to us. This has easily been one of my favorite episodes to record.
Mine too.
I learned a lot.
The first live episode.
Yeah,
with
in person
with your 2 guests and with our guest for the show. So it's been quite a experience, quite a moment here.
Well, thank you for inviting me, and I enjoyed it, and I want to thank you guys for asking me.
It's our honor.
It's our honor.
Yeah, I mean you're the man. You have
you
put in the
much.
work and you have all that background and that history to show for it.
And remember, the truth is like medicine. It doesn't always taste good, but it is always good for you.
Yeah.
Thank you for listening to Tales from Atlantis, a project of the Chimali Institute of Mesoamerican Arts. If you enjoy the show, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter. You can do this by visiting talesfromatlantis.com and clicking Support the Podcast. Your continued support will help keep the podcast ad-free and independent. Until next time, Timo Itase.